Hello everyone, good Erev Shabbos. This is the last in the segment of the dress code for davening, and we have one little tiny issue to deal with. If indeed the standard of the Chazzan is different than the standard of the congregation, it's a higher standard, can the congregation come along and say, look, Masechet Sofrim said, Gnaihu latzibur, it actually hurts the congregation that someone with either short pants or short sleeves represent us. If we don't mind, then it's okay. Namely, if the whole problem is kvod hatzibur, the respect of the congregation, perhaps if the congregation doesn't mind, there wouldn't be an issue. So this brings us to another tangent issue in this regard, and that is to actually have a congregation with a permanent chazan, not someone that goes up and davens mincha ma'ariv, but a permanent chazan, that's a very young person. The Shut HaRosh, the responsible of the Rosh, says, Mi shalom mitmaleh skano, someone that does not yet shave, doesn't have facial hair, can daven be'akrai, can daven from time to time, aval ubilvat shelo yitmaneh bipi hatzibur. He should not be the permanent chazan of that congregation. When his son, the Tur, Rav Yaakov Balaturim, comes along and codifies this law, he repeats what his father says and ultimately says that if the person does not yet shave, then he should not be the permanent chazan for the congregation. Once again, since the problem is kvod hatzibur, the respect of the congregation, there's an interesting machlokes what that means. Comes along the Beit Yosef and says, if indeed the congregation says, we don't mind, then it's fine. And the Levush from Mordechai Yafa says, that indeed it's like hurtful to the congregation that someone so young should be their chazan. Obviously, if they would like, they can forego the whole thing. If they say, we don't mind, it would be fine. However, the Bach says something totally different. He says the definition is not kvod hatzibur in the sense of who do you represent, but rather before whom you stand. Says the Bach, Ve'en perush mipnei kvod hatzibur shu keneged kvodam lefi bnei adam shetluyi bo mechilat hatzibur, ela perusho she'en ze kavod hatzibur sheyishlechu na'ar lifnei melech malchei hamlachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Namely, what it really means is, it is not respectful to that congregation that such a young boy should be their permanent chazan before God. And from this perspective, the Tiferet Yisrael, who was an interesting individual, he died in 1910, he was a Rizhiner and Sadigora Chassid, he wrote a beautiful perush to the Mishnayos. So Rav Davening Urtenberg, who ultimately says, "Dechol kvod hatzibur ein ratzah lomar kvod hatzibur shera'oi lahem." It doesn't mean what is good for the congregation, ela ratzah lomar hakavod shechayavin hatzibur lechabed et Hashem. But rather, what is the congregation obligated to do in order to be respectful and representative before God? Namely, it's not up to the congregation; it's an objective criteria of who should be their representative before God. And the Machatzita Shekel, whose real name wasn't half a shekel, obviously, we are talking about Rav Shmuel Kalin, years 1724 to 1806. Ultimately, he lived most of his life in the Czech Republic. And from this perspective, he had many interesting students, amongst them the Chasam Sofer. He comes along and says, "She'en kvod hatzibur sheyasu shluchim ka'elu lamakom yitbarach," that it's not respectful to the congregation that such a young boy should be their permanent representative before God. So to sum up, does kvod hatzibur mean, listen, who do you represent? So let's ask them, do you mind if the chazan davens with shorts? If the answer is no problem, he can go up. But if it means no, before whom you stand, namely, what's the most respectful thing that the congregation to do before God, then obviously it's not up to the congregation to decide that particular determination. And indeed, la halacha, we have this machlokas. So the Pri Chadash says that the Beit Yosef in a different place seems to imply from Rabbeinu Yerucham that it's up to the congregation, and he actually infers it from the Mordechai. However, the Beit Yosef says, Mashma shafal pisha tzibur machlim al kvodam ein lamanuto. Even if the congregation says, we don't mind, you shouldn't make this the permanent chazan, this young boy. And indeed, the Bach, based on his definition we just said, also concurs, as does the Pri Chadash, who says, anytime the Gemara or the Mishnah says kvod hatzibor, respect of the congregation, it makes no difference what the congregation thinks, but rather it's a code word of who should be the most appropriate and suitable person before God. And indeed, the Magen Avraham says exactly the same thing, as does the Tiferet Yisrael we just quoted. And finally, the Mishnah Bura, in the name of the Eliyahu Rabbah, says, Ve'ein hatzibur yochalim limchol al kvodam bazeh. So from this perspective, the majority of poskim actually say that it's not up to the congregation. It's actually who is the most suitable person that you should put up there in order to represent you before God. So therefore, even if you have a congregation that says, we don't mind the shorts, we don't mind the age, obviously, if it's a one-time thing, it's different than permanent, but if it's permanent, it should not be done constantly. And I think on this Erev Shabbos, it's important to think about this, namely, not just are we davening, but who's our representative before God? And more importantly, is he the most suitable person in the room that should represent us before God in Chazarat Hashatz, in the public Amidah, and all the other things that need a minyan? Minyan is not just about getting it over with and saying, I have davened, but rather the davening should be the best davening possible. And therefore, amongst the many things we look for in a proper shliach tzibur, we should also look for the most suitable person dressed properly, and obviously not only dressed properly, but in terms of maturity and age and many other things, he should be the person that goes up there. Obviously, only for the things that require a minyan. Things that don't require a minyan, Pesukei de Zimra, Kabbalat Shabbat. I personally encourage every young boy, regardless of the way they're dressed, to obviously go up there because we have to start and train them early. But beyond that, obviously when they become bar mitzvah and they get older, then obviously they should continue becoming chazanim when they're dressed properly. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and Besora Tova. וכל מוישוי סייכם לססים אלוכו, לססים אלוכו. ונערייכם יבנוי סייכם, היבד וגם שפחו. אשר ימי שבו, סבייני מבס, וקייגו ציקים מיכו על מחווה.